In just a few moments, we'll have Professor Kimberly Johnson, Associate Chair of the Department of English, introduce Dr. Matthews. First, I want to tell you a little bit about the Beckham Lecture Series and the Beckhams who are here with us this morning. Dr. Raymond E. Beckham spent 42 years at BYU, 21 years on the faculty and 21 years in administration. And he taught advertising and public relations, served as the Director of Development and Public Services, founded the Aspen Grove Family Camp, Travel Studies Department, and Evening School at BYU, and also the New York City Internship Program in the School of Communications, which continues today and is one of the great opportunities that we have and our students have. Dr. Beckham has been awarded numerous awards from BYU, including Man of the Year, Presidential Medal, and Alumni Distinguished Service Award. He's been a member of several church executive committees and has served as a bishop, stake president, mission president, temple sealer, and in a temple presidency and a regional representative of the 12 equivalent to an area authority today. He married Ida Lee Jackson in 1947, and the couple has 5 children, 19 grandchildren, and he has 23 great-grandchildren. Following the passing of his wife Ida Lee in 1994, he married Jeanette Callister Hales. We appreciate her being with us today also. She's the former president of the Church General Young Women's Program, and she and her former husband, Robert H. Hales, have 5 children and 14 grandchildren. We're grateful also that Randy, Ray's son, could be with us today. Please join me in thanking the Beckhams for establishing this lecture series and all their support of BYU. Following Professor Johnson's introduction of Dr. Matthews, we'll hear the lecture, and at the conclusion there will likely be some time for questions and answers. The audio-visual folks ask that if you use the mic, that it can show up on the video recording, so that's helpful. If you shout from the audience, then Dr. Matthews has to repeat the question so we can capture that and the answer. Professor Johnson.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure to introduce Kristen Matthews. Dr. Matthews is Associate Professor in the English Department, where she teaches classes primarily in American literature of the 20th century. Approaching American literature with an awareness of its larger cultural context in American history, she has published articles on subjects as diverse as African American poet Mari Evans, Thomas Pynchon's novel The Crying of Lot 49, Alfred Hitchcock, Mad Magazine, and Barbecue. Indeed, her exploration of Cold War nationalism and the barbecue earned the Stone Suderman Prize for Best Article in the journal American Studies, one of the top journals in her field. Her study of Lorraine Hansberry's play A Raisin in the Sun is one of Project Muse's most frequently downloaded articles. She has received numerous teaching awards, as well as BYU's prestigious Alcuin Fellowship, and she is a recipient of the Albert J. Colton Research Fellowship from the Utah Humanities Council. Dr. Matthews is currently completing work on a scholarly monograph called A is for America, Cold War Literature and the Politics of Reading, which will be published next year by the University of Massachusetts Press. She currently directs the American Studies program in BYU's College of Humanities. Dr. Matthews is widely beloved as a teacher and mentor to her students and relied upon as a dedicated and efficient citizen of our profession, both on BYU's campus and beyond. All this, plus she writes sublime limericks. I feel both blessed and honored that she is my friend and my sister. Please join me in welcoming Kristen Matthews.
Good morning. I would like to thank the School of Communications for inviting me to give this lecture, the Beckham family for their generosity, and all of you who have chosen to be with us today. I'm excited to share my research with you on the ways that print culture functioned in the student movements of the 1960s. Many scholars of post-World War II American literature have recognized speech's function in energizing the New Left, yet none have examined reading's essential role in the evolution of New Left politics. This oversight has produced a significant blind spot when it comes to understanding the motivation, medium, and message for student activists of the 1960s. limiting radical politics to the spoken word has indirectly located power in the hands of the recognizably vocal few, and thereby has created a hierarchical structure of political participation, say political participation fast, if you will, with spokesmen at the top, a structure akin to that which the New Left was trying to dismantle as it worked for civil and human rights. Furthermore, such stratification has reinforced the spokesperson narrative of the New Left employed by the mainstream press and political establishment that sought to diminish the movement's reach and power by reducing it to the rantings of a few leaders like Mario Savio, Thomas Hayden, and Mark Rudd. While many scholars have acknowledged the volumes of print material produced and disseminated by the New Left, they've done so in passing, focusing primarily on content or the material's corollary event, therein failing to examine the medium itself in its ideological and historical context. Because the New Left was comprised of many loosely affiliated groups that at times worked together and other times did not, mapping out a comprehensive and coordinated schema of New Left print culture isn't possible. Accordingly, this presentation focuses primarily on the writings of the radical student movement, specifically that of Students for a Democratic Society, for whom print culture was both the alpha and omega. If one surveys the bulk of print matter disseminated in the 1960s, one sees that SDS produced the majority of it while working independently and in larger coalitions for civil and human rights. In fact, SDS became known, among other things, as the writingest organization around. Founded in 1962, SDS became an ensign for New Left print production, adapting and extending radical print traditions in the US, such that print was both the means and an end, simultaneously recruiting, teaching, organizing, and radicalizing large portions of America's dispossessed with its ever-present and ever-abundant materials. SDS's means of populist education thematized its message, for its use of inexpensively copied or mimeographed pamphlets, flyers, leaflets, postlets, manuals, underground newspapers, you name it, they printed it. It worked to create a democratic community in which each individual's participation was equally sought and valued. While only part of the larger whole, SDS was recognized as the organized expression of that movement, its intellectual mentor and the source of much of its energy, as well as the organization that most obviously represented the grassroots, often spontaneous political expression of dissent, opposition, and desire for change. The byline of New Left Notes said, "Let the people decide," and the flood of print disseminated by SDS offered people many choices. However, close reading SDS's print matter provides only part of the story, and it is when one recognizes that the medium is the message that one best understands the revolutionary role of the word in student activism. SDS's print was a product of its Cold War context, wielding a message and a method counter to the government's modus operandi, which demanded secrecy and a centralization of knowledge to wage its war of words against communism. Indeed, many of SDS's projects use print to provide information to populations traditionally denied such, whether they be poor urban dwellers without access to education, job training, or public representation, students subject to paternalistic university policies, or an American populace from whom news of what was really taking place in Vietnam was being withheld. Student radicals employed print's matter and mechanisms to strike a blow at Cold War America's dominant narratives, questioning the authority by which such was authored for millions of Americans divested of a creative opportunity to create America for themselves. SDS's perpetually producing presses strove to liberate print from the confines of a centralized author or authority, democratizing the production, reproduction, and distribution of print matter to help the people circulate their own ideas, and therein define themselves as subjects and citizens. Grounding this project was a faith in print's power to transform individuals through reading, changing the literal and epistemological world in which they lived, and transforming reader citizens into a site of revolutionary activity. At the same time, SDS print culture's decentralized production and distribution complicated the movement's operations as the volume and variety of print hastened fragmentation, problematized coalition, and prevented the movement from outlining a single political strategy. Thus, looking at SDS's print culture provides a way of reading the power and contradictions endemic to the New Left as it participated in a significant front of America's domestic Cold War, the battle of and over information, and in doing so, understand better the politics of constituting America in the post-war period. Characterizing the New Left is a challenge, although the Port Huron statement self-identified members of the student left as, quote, people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit. Elsewhere, members had a hard time articulating a succinct definition of membership and program, admitting it's difficult to say really who we are. Even Georgetown's alternative student handbook, Not With My Life You Don't, admits the movement is a difficult and complex thing to describe. It is much a form of ongoing experience as an organization. In a sense, SDS undergoes a perpetual identity crisis. Because of its strong anti-elitist and decentralist strains, SDS is as diverse as its 30 college chapters and its 40,000 members. In many ways, the New Left's obscurantism signaled its resistance to what participants saw as American liberalism's faith in prescriptive or bound ideologies. The crazy quilt pattern of membership and activity was essentially anti-organizational politics, typified by the attempt to embody personal and anti-hierarchical values in politics as students worked towards a living activism that would grow and change with each new member. The New Left embraced a bottom-up organizational structure in order to encourage a form of populist diversity. In so doing, they broke with their old left predecessors, whom they saw as wed to Marxist dogma and hierarchy, and turned on post-war liberal intellectuals whom they criticized for clinging to a vital political center hamstrung by anti-communism. Proclaiming, we have no sure formulas, no closed theories, student radicals argued that the search for theories and the creation of human values is complex but worthwhile. And in many ways, what initially distinguished the New Left from its radical predecessors was its search for, rather than its application of, theory. Nevertheless, the New Left did not appear ex nihilo, but rather emerged from a tradition of radical print culture rooted in revolutionary humanism. And of course, we could take this all the way back to before the United States were the United States and the ways in which print culture functioned to bring about the revolution. More recently, with SDS, some of its members were red diaper babies whose parents were involved in the radical activities of the old left and who exposed their children to the power of print. Others who joined SDS inherited the print tradition of its parent student organization, the Student League for Industrial Democracy, or SLID, which had become a social democratic clearinghouse for liberal and left liberal ideas and causes. Still, others came to the New Left through their involvement in the civil rights movement, particularly after working with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which strove to educate the people in the South's poor Black communities on how they could register to vote and participate in local and national politics. Many students were recruited to these efforts through flyers, inheriting both a legacy of radically populist American thought and provisional models for their political change. However, the New Left broke from previous generations that saw print merely as a vehicle for ideas, instead valuing radical print for communicating a populist politic with a form that could be created, reproduced, and disseminated by and for any person. New technologies allowed this generation to print materials in large numbers at little to no cost. No longer the property of the highly educated, the wealthy, or the politically orthodox, print materials arguably could be extended as far as the mimeograph or Xerox machine could go. At SDS's national office, the ancient typewriters clacked incessantly, and its new $300 multi-lith machine, the organization's proudest symbol, churned out broadsheets and announcements far into the night. Locating SDS's core in its multi-lith reproductive capability signals how the organization's birth and intellectual offspring were one and the same. Student radicalism was part of an old tradition being born again through the left's access to and means of reproducing information. Thus, one could argue that print culture helped to develop the new of the new left. SDS in particular exhibited a fervent faith in the power of print to help people become born again into a consciousness of their self and their part in the democratic process. In its founding statement, the Port Huron Statement, it reveals much about the organization's aspired place in and transformation of America's radical print heritage. On the one hand, the framers of the statement announced that it was an effort rooted in the ancient, still unfulfilled conception of man attaining determining influence over his circumstances of life. They claimed a radical heritage in the strict sense of getting at the root or the origin of an idea, and in this case, self-determination. On the other hand, the introductory note declared that the statement was, quote, a living document open to change with our times and experiences, recognizing that, since its adoption, there have been changes in the American and world scenes and changes in SDS as well. And although few of its original writers would agree today with all of its conclusions, it remains an essential source of SDS direction, a continual stimulus to thinking on campuses and in the movement, and one of the earliest embodiments of the feelings of the new movement of young people, which began in the 60s. Ancient, yet living, rooted, yet open to change, individual-focused, yet movement-based, the Port Huron Statement embodied complexity as it tackled the evils facing that generation: poverty, racism, the H-bomb, and American military imperialism, and proposed their solution of participatory democracy. The manifesto defined participatory democracy as a method of civic engagement governed by two central aims. First, that the individual share in those social decisions determining the quality and direction of his life, and second, that society be organized to encourage independence in men and provide the media for their common participation. Participatory democracy was both an end and a goal, and whether utopic, idealistic, or radical, at the heart of the emerging New Left was the belief that informed individuals could bring about a second democratic revolution in America. Conceived as a document always already changing form, Port Huron thematized participatory democracy as it offered readers both a mode of civic action and the media for common participation. Media generic, yet specific enough to fit particular moments, movements, and members. Port Huron's communal production and distribution further illustrated the power that access to knowledge and freedom to express one's opinion could provide. SDS's 1962 Port Huron meeting was largely a drafting session. Prior to the meeting, Tom Hayden sent about 100 draft copies of the statement to fellow attendees. Once there, they all were involved in hammering out ideas and language: men, women, students, and community members. After much wrangling and revision, the writers finished an initial version of the statement that they then mimeographed and distributed by hand and mail to SDS chapters across the country. The demand was great, and often the National Office's slowness in reproducing copies meant that one tattered document would pass through the hands of dozens of students, therein practicing a democracy both individual and communal. Within 5 months, the National Office was out of copies, and in the next 2 years, no fewer than 20,000 mimeographed copies were sent out. The 35-cent pamphlet version 2 sold out its 20,000 copies in both its 1964 and 66 printings. New Left chronicler Massimo Teodori estimates that over 100,000 copies of the pamphlet were circulated within the first 5 years of its conception. At the beginning, SDS's print culture was collectively authored, reproduced, and distributed. Furthermore, it was action-oriented as campus and neighborhood canvassing magnified the civic action performed in and by the text. Port Huron's forum also worked to capture the eye and mind of potential reader activists and trigger a revolutionary democratic movement. The pamphlet's cover displays participatory democracy's dual aims in large italicized font to attract people's attention and draw them inside the pamphlet and the movement. The statement was cheap and portable, reinforcing its primary focus of returning democracy to the people. Its second printing as a pocket-sized pamphlet, this one here, made it easier to keep it on one's person and make it part of one's person. Because the pamphlet could be perpetually on hand, its chances of being shared were greatly increased, thus binding the pamphlet's portability to its community-building power. This pocket-sized manifesto's form created and filled a revolutionary need, getting print matter to the people and efforts to make knowledge accessible and help cultivate humankind's potential to live with what they called dignity and creativeness. As a result of this informational blitzkrieg, SDS swelled in numbers and could then turn its print efforts towards the larger community. Formation of groups like the Economic Research and Action Project, or ERAP, there are lots of fun acronyms during this time. But then again, we're at BYU, which is all about acronyms, so we should feel right at home. ERAP was a multi-city program in which student volunteers moved into poor urban neighborhoods to help organize and mobilize community for causes like tenants' rights, hiring equity, and fair housing practices. And there, the program linked radical print with activism, as organized measured the program's efficacy by, quote, terms of how successfully they gave away their own power. Because SDS equated information with power, giving information away to the people in the literal form of print matter was, in fact, giving power to the people. Student radicals believed that the better they distributed the word, the more powerful the movement would become. And the sheer volume of radical student print is staggering. And the beauty of the medium, that anybody can use it, is also what makes a strict accounting of how much was produced impossible. Nevertheless, records do show that over 100,000 copies of the Port Huron Statement were distributed, that by '64, SDS's bulletin was read at least by 2,000 people, that by the mid-'60s, SDS had published over 92 position papers and pamphlets, and recognized this is within 2 years of its founding, and that at least 400,000 pieces of literature were distributed during the anti-war teach-ins that dotted the country in 1965, and finally, that approximately 1,000 members handed out over 500,000 copies of the 4-page National Vietnam Examination to those taking the Selective Service exam, and there's much, much more. One word that could describe them is prolific, or as James Coonan said of SDS's unofficial Columbia headquarters, you could hardly move for the leaflets here. That SDS was able to generate so much print is a testament to their tenacity and industriousness as participants in this information war. The organization's national office had its own mimeograph, multilith, and eventually Xerox machine. And just a little side note, Xerox, the company, it originally was known as SDS, the acronyms, System, I will find it for you. But they changed it to Xerox in order not to be confused with the student movement. And this hardware in the national office was captured by CBS in their 1965 piece on SDS, which showed staffers mimeographing and printing different pamphlets. Yet keeping those machines running took most, if not all, of the dues that members theoretically paid. In the spring of 1963, the national office received $67 in dues, paid out $48 for postage, and $167 for mimeo paper and ink, therein working SDS into the red as they labored to keep the black ink of information flowing. SDS historian Alan Adelson has said, raising enough money to pay the phone bills and printing literature is a chronic problem in SDS. And this was a problem memorialized in song by one Boston member who said, have you heard the news? We aren't fighting to lose. Sometimes it's bail, sometimes it's lit, but you can't get either without cash for it. Somehow, and you'll be glad I didn't sing that, somehow SDSers found means to reproduce their materials even in times of conflict. During the 1968 Columbia University takeover, for example, SDS liberated President Grayson Kirk's Xerox 3000, using it to copy scores of documents and to leave him a note. Stopped by to visit you, but you weren't in. Sorry to have missed you, SDS. Putting the note in the Xerox both reinforced print's primacy in SDS's struggle and signaled the group's dedication to keep information accessible at all costs. More significantly, SDS's strategically placed note symbolized its students' declaration of war on America's message makers and secret keepers. For, as President Eisenhower called it, the military-industrial complex and the New Left had been engaged in the battle for the minds of Cold War Americans, a battle based on the premise that whomever controlled the narratives of nation, self, and other would control the idea of America. The materials produced by both government agencies and the New Left expressed a particular Americanness that the authors hoped would construct a more perfect union of sorts. Although these organizations' short-term aims were to disrupt the other with print, their long-term goals differed significantly. For groups like SDS used disruption to trigger a radical reconsideration of America, whereas, say, the FBI's counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, employed disruption to maintain a status quo, both economic and political. To put it another way, whereas the New Left strove to create an open, or what they called a living narrative of individual and nation, the FBI in particular attempted to author a closed narrative of citizen and country. Governmental agencies cited radical student print culture as evidence of illegal, dangerous, or anti-American activity, referencing petitions, flyers, pamphlets, posters, and underground papers to substantiate claims of subversion and to justify surveillance in a manner hauntingly similar to earlier efforts to expose communism in the 1940s and 50s. Documents, not individuals, stood trial, collapsing the distinction between the medium, the message, and the members of the left. According to a 1968 FBI memo detailing a plan to discredit and dismantle the New Left, print matter would be the Bureau's most effective weapon as it mimicked the form of radical print culture. And you see in particular this note saying, hey, you know, the hippies, they're really mystical. So PH believes that this propensity for symbolism can be used if we create a series of anonymous messages with mystical connotations. And that somehow if they create these fake New Left documents like these, beware the Siberian beetle, or beware the Asiatic toad, that somehow this would undermine and break down the New Left. I don't know about you, but I find them terrifying in a different sort of way. Although SDS's primary goal was participatory democracy, its first use in this battle was necessarily recruitment, as illustrated by the ubiquitous "Join Us" found on all of their print matter. Bold headlines, provocative photos, and the truth were splashed across these materials in hopes of starting conversation. For instance, the writers of Georgetown's Alternative Handbook invited discussion and debate by saying, if you have questions or if you have reservations about our position, feel free at any time to contact us. We look forward to seeing you. If you find yourself in substantial agreement, join us. Door-to-door leafleting campaigns like those that called for in Don't Mourn, Organize, and nope, we'll see it in a little bit. We don't go backwards. Were common and notably evidenced during Vietnam summer of 1967, in which tens of thousands of volunteers went knocking on doors to provide information to ordinary citizens and spread the anti-war message. Time and time again, radical literature worked to somehow reach the unconvinced with arguments and analysis that speak to what they saw as their day-to-day oppression in America. Getting the word out was meant to get people in to meetings and the movement. And the reader response to these materials are somewhat hard to gauge, but if we take a look at the numbers of those who are involved in particular chapters or particular events, and if we take a look at anecdotal evidence, we can sketch out a portrait of radical power, print's power. I found tons of personal narratives of students involved in both the SNCC and SDS, and even conservative groups like Young Americans for Freedom, the YAFs, and how print culture worked. I got recruited to the demonstration by being handed a leaflet, or a woman in SDS gave me some lit to read. Back at my dorm, I talked to all my friends about it, or back at the apartment, I read a mimeograph paper by Tony. It hit me kind of hard, like it dispelled my dominant illusion, and you can almost hear "man" implied there. Dispelled my dominant illusion, man, and so on and so forth. In these accounts and others, individuals locate their recruitment, activism, and consciousness raising in print materials, suggesting that these materials did have that intended effect on real readers. Implicit in their recruitment effort was their educative aim. Organizers believed that as people learn the facts, their consciousness would be raised and they would join the movement. Yet, SDS never articulated explicitly how print itself could change consciousness. Rather, it seemingly assumed that its print materials would affect a reader transformation that was immediate and unmediated, that once people knew, they would just automatically resist. Few movement print materials entertained the notion that ideas would not be accepted or accepted but not acted upon. Instead, there was this naive assumption that access to information was all that was limiting change. Sometimes this assumption played out, as seen in the first and well-attended anti-war march in Washington in 1965. But other times, the assumption that all who read would be moved to act was disproved, like with SDS's National Vietnam exam that failed to incite a mass refusal to sit for the selective service exam. Nevertheless, SDS believed teaching people to read print matter social problems and ultimately themselves was central to the revelation of new levers for change. They printed papers on a range of issues, consciously resisting becoming a single issue movement in the hopes of reaching a broader audience representative of America's diversity. The decentralization of print meant that a campus or a neighborhood could be leafleted by multiple groups on issues like poverty, civil rights, or draft resistance at any one point in time. Don't Moore, Organize argued that such multi-issue organizing allowed one to reach more people in a community, for it is more in line what they said is the reality of a community. In addition, multi-issue organizing allowed individuals in specific communities to learn about and work for issues that move them, therein allowing them to participate in the governance of their lives as they would choose. Ideally, the truths of democracy would be localized and fitted to their particular lived experience. At the same time, SDS's scattershot focus also gave the impression that it was trying to do too many things, suggesting perhaps that its faith in print's power overstepped its ability to make it happen. SDS's educational print efforts subordinated focus and constancy to access, such that its print culture would be characterized like William Lutz's underground press directory, hard to pin down at any one point in time and therefore imperfect and temporary. Leaflets, pamphlets, and posters are temporary by nature, something to be glanced at and thrown away. The medium's temporariness also suggested impermanence to the issues and people with whom organizers worked. Some within the movement recognized and criticized this perceived disposability, arguing that a deep understanding of oppression did not come from having 10 students descend on a community, pass out leaflets about urban renewal or the draft, but rather that it came from learning as well as teaching and as being permanent members of a community. Positive examples of exchange included organizers in Cincinnati who found a place where most of the people of the neighborhood worked and went and got jobs there, accomplishing several goals, getting to know the needs of the area, getting to know the people of the area, and making it so that the people of the area could get to know them. E-rappers stressed that the temporary nature of initial print contact had to be followed up with a more sustained project. That activists must put down geographic and epistemological roots in order to form a radical community. And this criticism points to a larger problem within the movement. While print matters were produced for mass distribution to the people, the distinction between writer and audience often set up an us-them division that troubled SDS's aim for decentralized politics. Many pamphlets were written to mobilize and ultimately liberate oppressed peoples, yet oppressed peoples were either spoken of and not to, or often talked down to by the material's authors. For instance, in two pamphlets, Getting Ready for the Firing Line and We've Got to Reach Our Own People, they repeatedly referred to the working poor as these people and members of these communities, signaling that the you of the pamphlet was the student audience and that they were separate from. The rhetoric in and dissemination of this created two categories of print community, one for the educated organizer and one for the ignorant to be organized. Take a Step into America identified this well-intentioned elitism and argued that legitimacy in the community won't come from 4 to 6 or 8 years of college, superior knowledge, and superior conceptualization, because those things reinforce the very hierarchies the movement was trying to dismantle. Print went into the communities, but was rarely produced by the communities themselves on a large scale. And I will skip just a little bit so we have some time for conversation. If we read SDS through its print culture, we can complicate simplistic representations of the New Left found in conventional histories and cultural memory. The volume and variety of genres, issues, and authors in SDS's archive resist reductive narratives that either demonize or deify the movement and its participants, instead revealing an organization of many contradictory parts which catalyzed social change even as its flawed membership and methods sometimes thwarted its endgame of creating a fully participatory democracy in America. SDS print demonstrates that many participated in authoring themselves in the movement, challenging the narrative that SDS consisted of 3 or 4 dominant personalities and replacing it with one of popular difference. Contrastingly, the continuity of print modes and aims among different groups and factions within the New Left points towards greater cohesion in the movement and more to this loose coalition that scholars have recognized. The ubiquitous belief that print's production, replication, and transmission was power, action, and revolution bridged widely varying factional territory, including the 2 camps that SDS split into in 1969, the Action faction and the Praxis Axis. Great names. Most scholarship marks this split as the end of the movement, and although the Action faction demanded aggressive militant confrontation, as opposed to the continued more grassroots educative organizational mode of the Praxis Axis, SDS print shows that this division wasn't so divided because readers were considered revolutionary sites themselves who could not help but be actively engaged in the cause. Studying SDS's print culture too offers a more nuanced understanding of participatory democracy as a political mode, highlighting both its limitations and successes as necessarily authored by print. While radical student print did awaken many individuals to political self-determination, the potential of living documents to affect perpetual change in each individual also contributed to the movement's struggles. Early documents called for self-determination and individual choice, but the multiplicity of choices also facilitated political transience. Indeed, the many radical causes with their individual members, programs, and aims institutionalized the fragmentation of the New Left into yippies, diggers, weathermen, young lords, Black Panthers, PLPers, women's libbers, and many, many other groups. Even within particular organizations, multi-issue organizing split the focus among many issues. It was easy to move from one cause to another and subsequently forestall organizational structures from really taking hold. But despite these limitations, participatory democracy had its successes, as evidenced by increased activism and grassroots civic participation that persists even now, as well as the rebirth of SDS in 2006. In fact, even SDS's fragmentation, which many scholars have deemed its failure, as evidence of a movement towards participatory democracy. If one end of the New Left was to help informed individuals work towards and share in the decisions determining the quality and direction of their lives, then the many groups emerging from the radical student left can be seen as both vehicles and evidence of this concerted, individualized civic engagement. The members of these groups chose to participate in their specific organization because it spoke to their particular lived condition and needs. Thus, on a micro level, they were independently determining the social structure of their life, and they did so through adapting the radical print culture they engaged with as part of the larger movement. Ultimately, revisiting the New Left via its print culture helps illuminate the complex relationship between readership and citizenship in Cold War America and provides another way of understanding the processes involved in narrating nation. Thank you. So we have a mic down here with a spotlight, and we have about 9 minutes for questions. So, and they would like to capture your voice on that, which might intimidate you from coming down, or you can shout and I can echo. Or we can all sing "We Shall Overcome Together." No? Okay, come on down.
So I was just curious, I am familiar with zines from the punk community years ago. So were these considered zines? Like what's kind of the genealogy of that?
Okay, thank you. So in the 60s and 70s, there were tons and tons of underground radical newspapers. But newspapers specifically writing against what they saw was, the mainstream press, which they felt wasn't really covering the whole story. And so these underground papers, you could pick them up in various city centers like San Francisco, Chicago, Detroit, but also there was one in Ames, Iowa, if I remember correctly. So, and these were community efforts, largely volunteer efforts. And we can see those because they're oppositional print evolving into other forms of oppositional print in the 80s and the 90s. And I think zines are one form of that. At times less political, but with early punk at least, it still had that political aim and that effort to kind of self-determine the message. Yeah, thank you.
Just wanted to say thank you for your excellent presentation and your nuanced reading of the movement. And I was curious about the Port Huron statement that says it encouraged, participation and sharing. And I wonder, how is print-based activism, or I should phrase it this way, how is today's digital type of activism different than this print-based activism? Because I'm seeing some parallels. The temporality of the print medium, the digital medium is not as temporal, but it's being buried under new information constantly. Right. So what similarities and what differences do you see between both types?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, as you started talking, I immediately thought about the portability of it, right? Because almost everyone except for someone sitting in the front row now has a smartphone, right? Some people still cling to their flip phones. But most people have a smartphone, right? So they're carrying around with them the means to these things. So whether it is a text or a tweet or something else, calling up a flash mob or a story that is coming to your attention, that portability and that immediacy is there. I think that the cheapness as well, we can see a lot of the print culture of the New Left was done on the cheap and inexpensive. And in my collection, I didn't show the one. There's some that you could barely even read because the memo copy was smudged, but they still handed it out. And I think that using the internet and other forms, it's free other than your phone or your computer service charge. And so you have that element of it. Though I do think that there is something different about having that tangible, tactile piece of paper or something in your hand that changes how we engage with the idea. And we see that people still haven't given that up completely. You walk around campus and people will still go to give you a handbill, or we'll see that being used and adopted by advertising. For better, getting your idea, catching your attention for a new thing, or for worse, walking around in Vegas, right? And so there is something still about having that tangible matter in your hand that engages a slightly different kind of, I was going to say engagement, but that's kind of circular, that demands a different kind of engagement. And maybe I just say that because I'm still very much so a print material culture person. But studies, at least on reading, show that there are different modes of cognition that go with reading something that's print as opposed to something that's digital.
Do you feel that different type of engagement that print culture offered made it more persuasive to its audiences than perhaps more digital media today?
I don't know, and I'm hesitant because we talk about how the apathy of this generation, right? Sorry. That they are less politically involved or charged. And I don't know if it's because instead of someone coming up and handing you something, you get something over your phone and you don't have that person-to-person contact, that it changes the activation, right? I guess a corollary for an LDS audience would be, how would missionary work change if we quit sending people out to go knock on doors and canvass or tract, right? And instead just did it all online or through TV or through a digital medium, right? That's not saying one is wholly better than others, but I think that now that we have both, using both, whether it be for religious, political, neighborhood, whatever, using both to complement each other, I think will elicit an even stronger response and create a bigger audience. Because I know my neighbors, they don't have a computer. And so whenever the ward email list sends something out, I then go and have to tell them what's going on, right? So that they are included in this particular conversation. We have 2 more minutes, 2.5, so one more question. You'll have to arm wrestle.
Oh, shoot, sorry.
And Caitlin won.
Yes. I really liked the term that you used, well-intentioned elitism. And I kind of feel like in the kind of social movement on like Twitter and on the internet that kind of still exists, that separation between like us who are in college or just after college and writing about these things, and then like the people who are actually experiencing the injustice or the oppression. What's a way to include those voices that aren't heard?
Okay, thank you. I know, and this is a problem endemic to ideas of uplift, right? Because uplift always suggests that there's someone up here reaching down and bringing someone up, right? But at the same time, one could think about it as those who have access to certain privileges, right? Those who have access to education and access to these other opportunities, then the responsibility is put on them to use them in a certain way. And there are good ways of doing it and less good ways of doing it, right? So me writing something and telling the people, this is what you need to do in order to fix this, right? Perhaps not a good way to do it. However, I know folks, and a friend in particular in Brooklyn, who went into particular neighborhoods and helped them develop a grassroots newsletter program where they were producing the stories, they were writing what they wanted to write about. And all that he brought in was a particular digital platform that they could use and something else like that. And so allowing them, again, to determine what form the communication would take and how they would go about doing that. Okay, well, thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for your questions.